November 8, 1944. Achmer Airfield, Germany. And Me-262 noses toward the threshold, its twin Jumo engines coughing awake. A mechanic in oil-darkened overalls kneels to pull chocks, flinches at the blast of hot exhaust, and raises a gloved hand. The pilot, Oberleutnant with a ribbon bar and the look of a man who hasn't slept, leans forward, checks pressure, checks temperature, eases the throttles in millimeters. He cannot rush them. The engines spool slow, reluctant, like heavy wheels catching. Somewhere beyond the pine line to the west, a formation drags a contrail comb through the sky. He inches onto the center line. The runway is long. It has to be. At 9:20, a pair of dark specks drop out of the overcast at a steep angle. No siren, only the sudden whiplash snarl of air, the glint of sun on laminar wings. The specks become P-51s. Their pilots have the sun behind them, their canopies down, their guns set to converge at 300 yards. One breath, one unreal gap, then the first strafing burst chisels bright white lines along the concrete. The jet is still accelerating, still too slow, still blind with speed that hasn't arrived yet. The pilot shoves the throttles forward. A flame licks up in the left engine. He hesitates. He knows how quickly fire turns to a compressor stall. He knows how slowly these engines answer. He knows he cannot stop now. A single sentence hangs under the scene like a tripwire. Fastest in the sky and easiest to kill on the ground. Cut out fast to the map, the clock, the counters. Western Germany. Autumn into winter, 1944. Fuel graph, plunging for the Luftwaffe. Sortie rates climbing for the 8th and 9th Air Forces. New airfields inked into Allied hands as armies cross the Siegfried Line. A bright line shows jet bases. Achmer, Hesepe, Rheine, Neuburg, Lechfeld, Munich, Rheine. Lanes of approach overlap them like nets. The number that breaks the back of the myth, more than 100 miles an hour of speed advantage in the clean mid-altitudes. And yet, by winter's turn, pilots in Mustangs and Thunderbolts are learning to box the jets where speed cannot save them. Not up there, but right here, at the edge of concrete, in the 90 seconds between brake release and liftoff. That is the window. By November, the pattern is visible to anyone who can bear to look directly at it. German pilots trust the jet advantage. American pilots learn to time gravity, and the runways turn into killing zones. Zoom out and slow down. The air war is a system before it is a duel. The jet is a machine inside a larger machine. The Me-262 is not a rumor anymore. It is very fast, over 540 miles per hour in level flight when the engines are healthy and the air is cold and clean. It climbs hard. It can break apart a bomber formation with high-speed slashing passes, 4 30mm cannons spitting shells big enough to rip a wing spar. In the clear at altitude with warning, it chooses the terms of engagement. That is the promise. That is what the men on the jet bases hold in their minds when they write home that the war might yet hinge on velocity, but speed is conditional. Beneath the headline figure lies a long runway and a fragile throat. The Jumo 004 will give you thrust that moves the horizon, but only if you court it like something temperamental. It wants warm oil, it wants gentle throttle, it wants straight air free of dust. Jam the throttles and you invite flame out. Take the power back too quickly and you starve the fire. Ask for sudden changes and it sulks. From idle to full takes seconds that feel like minutes when flak pops ahead or a Mustang's shadow crosses the canopy. So the jet bases become rituals of caution. Fire bottles stand next to dispersal pens. Crews sweep the runway for debris. Taxiways arc wide to keep hot exhaust from kicking stones. Flak guns crouch near the threshold. FW-190s idle as Platzschutz, airfield guards ready to claw at anything diving on final. The jets sit on the grass inside camouflaged bays, and they are towed out with tractors. Everyone knows the moment of weakness. Every man near the strip plans his day around it. The Americans study the same moment from above. 9th Air Force P-47s drill low-level attacks with 500-pound bombs set to delay, so the runway will erupt only after the first pass, catching responders in the second. 8th Air Force P-51s escort bombers high, then peel into fighter sweeps with one objective: strike the jets at their bases, at their edges, on takeoff, on approach, on the rollout. The TAC map shows Mustang squadrons loitering not over cities but over pinpricks of concrete. The pilots learn the pattern of the landing circuit. They memorize the turn from base to final. They learn the sound of a jet when it's carrying its own death. Throttles spooled down, gear coming, flaps dropping, drag climbing. They learn patience. They learn to wait above the field for gear and flaps like a hunter waits for a hoof to enter a snare. The central why moves into focus. If a jet's speed is its shield, strip away speed and you strip away the shield. By October 1944, before the Ardennes, before the last winter, the duels are being decided by clocks and concrete more than by acrobatics. A pilot in a P-51 cannot run with the 262 at altitude and in the clear. He can, however, be waiting when the jet returns. The P-47 cannot match jet acceleration out of a dive. It can, however, rip the approach end of a runway into pitted cement and set it alight so that anything touching down must bounce or break. Attack the system, not just the airplane. Attack the ritual, not just the sortie. The first names to make this pattern feel personal are the ones pilots still say in mess halls years later. Captain Urban L. Ben Drew, 361st Fighter Group, October 7, 1944. He drops to treetop height near Achmer, sees two Me-262s lifting slow and nose high, and lights his tracers into the left jet's right engine. One engine flares, the jet sags, the other tries to pull it around. Physics wins. Drew swings and hits the second. 2 kills in moments, both in that mortal stretch between ground and sky. Captain Charles Chuck Yeager, 357th Fighter Group, October 12, 1944. He waits above a jet field, spots a 262 lowering gear, and dives with everything the Mustang will give. The jet ahead bleeds speed, committed to the groove. Yeager's 8 guns talk. The jet staggers, catches fire, slides earthward. High above, the logic writes itself. Fight a jet at 300 miles an hour and you have a chance. Try to fight it at 500 and you will watch it leave. Colonel John C. Meyer, 4th Fighter Group, November 26, 1944. He pushes his flight toward Achmer and Hesepe under scattered cloud, watches a 262 light up on takeoff, and, before its engines harden into thrust, cuts across the end of the runway like a scythe. When the Me-262 accelerates from fragile to formidable, the time is counted in seconds. He spends those seconds with bullets. Name after name adds to the texture. The outcomes rhyme. The system behind them clarifies. We shift scale. What does a day look like when the pattern is in full swing? Dawn at a jet base. Crews in parkas write temperatures in chalk on a blackboard, oil viscosity, air density. A squadron ops officer runs a finger along a map circle that marks flak positions. He circles the outer perimeter again to see where the last night's raids cratered. The flight schedule is a list of hopes, intercept windows aligned with bomber streams, a weather forecast that promises clear gaps at 20,000 feet. The men in the jets keep their helmets on the wings because it saves seconds. The guard flight in W-190s drinks black coffee and watches the runway from the tree line. Nobody speaks much. Everyone is a metronome. Mid-morning over the same base. Contrails form and vanish with the wind. At 20,000, an escort group slices the sky in racetrack ovals, disciplined and bored until the call. At 10,000, another pair orbits out of sight of the field, too high to hear, too far to scare the flak into firing early. At 5,000, a 4-ship of Mustangs holds in the blind just west of the sun, using the glare like a curtain. 20 miles out, a box of P-47s lines up on the airfield itself, their bomb racks heavy, their dive angles steep. The base siren screams. The jets taxi. The pattern begins. The first P-47 pass drops 2 bombs with long fuses across the midpoint of the main strip. The pilot's altimeter unwinds through 2,000 feet as tracer arcs up from flak pits. He feels the aircraft tremble as 50s rake revetments, armored plates shaped like horseshoes around the jets. He will not know whether the bombs were duds or delayed until he is already pulled up to the north, counting seconds, counting heartbeats. A minute later, with timing that seems almost malicious, the ground he crossed erupts, craters yawning, debris thrown into the landing path. The responders who sprinted out with fire extinguishers on handcarts are caught in the blast. The second P-47 element tilts in, sees the smoke, sees the pattern, and adjusts the second pass for the threshold lights and the taxiway turnoffs. They aren't hunting moving silhouettes. They are hunting the system that makes movement possible. Above them, the loitering P-51 pair sees the first Me-262 commit to takeoff. The pilot on the wing calls, "Watch that left, he's shallow," and lets the lead have the first run. There is no pursuit geometry here in the classic sense, no lead, lag, or pure pursuit angles scribbled on a chalkboard. There is timing. If the lead's burst hits while the jets are below 200 miles an hour, the rounds will walk across aluminum that cannot yet flex into safety. If the jet lives to pass 250, the window is closing. At 300, the window is sealed. From the ground, what this looks like is simple and terrible. One machine dependent on momentum and heat is being forced to fight before it has either. By December, the system learns back. The jets change bases, shifting from one strip to decoys and back again. Logs say Lechfeld, but the aircraft disperse to fields hidden by woods. Camouflage nets sink into the frost, painted to look like farmland from above. The jets practice snatch takeoffs, throttles held higher in taxi to shorten the time from brakes off to flight. Flak guns get closer to the threshold, closer still, until the men who run them can see the rivets on P-51 wings as they dive. Papagay Staffel, FW-190s of a special airfield defense flight, paint red and white stripes under their wings so the flak won't mistake them for Americans when they roll to meet a low-level attack. They race down the runway ahead of the returning jets, try to bait the Mustangs, try to disrupt the geometry of the trap. It works sometimes. The cost of teaching a system to defend its most vulnerable minute is blood and fuel. And time the Luftwaffe no longer has. We go back to the men to keep the numbers honest. Watch a German crew chief in March 1945 at Lechfeld slap the jet's skin with his palm to read its temperature. He knows the engine's lives are measured in dozens of hours if they're lucky. He knows the pilot will land with the engines hungry for careful hands. He also knows the Americans have learned to ride shotgun over that landing. Hear an American P-51 pilot in the 9th say, "We don't have to be faster today. We have to be earlier." He stares at a calendar of March and April where every second day is marked with airfield sweeps and strafing runs. He cannot remember the last time he fought a one-on-one at 25,000 feet. He can tell you the spacing between concrete patches on 2 German fields by heart. This is not the war as a contest of aces. This is the war as a contest of procedures. The runway battles grow their own choreography. Find the base, not by the big city nearby, but by the thin lines of service roads converging on a rectangle of gray. Count the flak puffs, but also count the seconds between them. That tells you how quickly they are tracking. Hit the runway with delayed fuses first. The explosion lag turns your exit into someone else's ambush. Keep 2 ships high in the sun. Keep 2 ships low and west. Keep the rest loose enough to pounce and tight enough not to scatter into flak. Wait for the gear. Wait for the flaps. Then go. A pattern of gestures hardens into doctrine. By late winter, Group Intel officers brief this as if it were weather. The 262 fields will be active from 900 to 1100 and again mid-afternoon, dictated by bomber stream timings. When the bombers are late, the jets are late. When a front moves in, the jets sit. When the Americans throw a small raid away from the main axis, it is not always the target that matters, but who the raid lures into motion. We let the numbers back in because they keep romance honest. A P-47D carries 8 50 caliber machine guns. At full load, that's roughly 3,400 rounds, and at 750 to 850 rounds per minute per gun, a pilot can melt away his violence in under half a minute of continuous fire. He will not fire continuously. He will tap in short, savage bursts that he counts in fractions, 0.2 seconds to stitch a revetment, 0.4 to saw across the leading edge of a wing, a full second if he is riding parallel with a rolling takeoff. Tracer is every 5th round. In the mind's eye, it is all tracer. In his gun camera, it looks like a bright, spitting hose. A P-51D's top speed hovers in the high 430s miles per hour at altitude. Its range with external tanks is the statistic that truly matters. It can stay. It can escort to Berlin and still hunt on the way home. It can circle a jet base until the crewmen on the ground know its markings and hate it in a personal way. If the P-47 is the hammer of the open field, the P-51 is the pick that worries at the seam until the rock splits. As the ground situation tightens, Allied armies push through the Roer, then across the Rhine. The radius to jet bases shrinks. What in September required careful fuel arithmetic in October is routine in February. The tempo goes up while the distance goes down. The physics of war tilt. What happened next made the pattern obvious. The early clashes where jets appeared like phantoms grew fewer. The late clashes where jets erupted into flame a mile from the threshold grew more common. The jet age had begun, but it had begun inside the cage of a collapsing logistics chain and under a sky owned by enemy fighters. The irony becomes personal when you hear a German pilot's private arithmetic. You can imagine him counting: engine temperature in Celsius, runway length in meters, time to rotate, power settings in percentages you dare not exceed too quickly. Twice, he has had to change power settings gently while Americans were already in a dive. Twice, he has felt how much speed is needed for that advantage he believes in to exist. He believes in it because he has felt it once or twice in clean air. A Mustang sliding backward in his gun sight as he accelerates away. He knows what it can do. He also knows when it's not there. So the Germans try to move the fight farther from the runway, to push the point of vulnerability into the climb rather than the roll. Some units take off in pairs with a guard and a principal, or with a tight turn at gear retraction to present a sideways target to the diving Mustangs. They flow the runway, one in, one out, to multiply targets and confuse angles. They scatter decoy tires along field edges to suggest a runway from high altitude. They shore up flak around the approach so thick that pilots call the final segment a black wall. And still, the Allied pilots learn to time the wall, to enter between bursts, to fire as the jet hesitates its second hesitation, gear retracting, flaps coming up, engines not yet caught up. If war were a physics problem, the solution here is mostly about derivatives. The rate of change, the slope of acceleration, not the absolute speed. We track one day like a heartbeat. March 20, 1945. Early haze burns off. A 262 lifts from Rheine Hopston. A Mustang pair drops from 10,000 and rips a burst into its left engine. The jet rolls, tries to return to the strip, leaves a score of black on grass where it plows in. 40 minutes later, another jet comes home to the same runway that now has two fresh craters 80 yards from the numbers, courtesy of a low-level P-47 run. The pilot flares, bounces, commits, and takes a propeller-sewn row of 50s across the canopy. In the afternoon, the base is quiet. A truck moves where an airplane would have moved. Men carry a stretcher toward a hangar with a tarp door painted to look like a barn. There is speed in this scene. It just belongs to the attackers, not the jets. The numbers tell a different story than the myth. The jets' unmatched speed did not decide the air war in the West because the air war in the West was no longer mainly decided at high altitude in clean air. It was decided where airplanes are forced to be slow and predictable. It was decided by who could show up most often at those predictable points with guns ready and fuel to stay. If this is true locally, this follows system-wide. The American pursuit of air supremacy used jets' vulnerabilities as a kind of lever, each base a hinge, each runway a pressure point. And when the bases themselves were within fighter-bomber reach, the lever lengthened. Every bomb crater doubled as a trap. Every strafing pass won twice. Once by burning an aircraft, and again by teaching everyone underneath that routine itself had become dangerous. We returned to a cockpit to keep all this from floating away. You are in a P-47 at 250 feet. The world is fields and hedges and threaded canals. The smell in your oxygen mask is metallic and sour. The cockpit is warm even in cold air because the engine is a furnace. Ahead, the airfield you have studied in photo recon enlarges. Main strip northeast to southwest, a shorter emergency strip, hangars cut into tree lines, a taxi circle like a roulette wheel on the west side. You think of the last intel brief. Jet operations usually start 20 minutes after level bombers cross the Dutch border. You check your clock. You line up on the approach end. You feel the aircraft grow light as you pick up speed. You hold down the trigger for less than a second, and 100 bright sparks rip across concrete. Somewhere, someone in a revetment puts hands to his ears. You do not see him. You lift. You count. 7, 8, 9. The delayed fuses talk. The world behind you churns black and gray. You are already turning to come back. Switch cockpits. You are in a Mustang now, 5,000 feet higher. The sun is a lid of white. The airfield is a toy. You see something metallic pull onto the runway and begin to move. You are patient. You toggle your drop tanks off because weight is the enemy of acceleration and milliseconds are money. The jet is a bead sliding on a wire. It slides slowly. At a point you have chosen and practiced, you put the nose down and the world accelerates toward you. You do not hear flak because the wind is screaming. You aim, not at the airplane itself, which is a small and shifting thing, but at the space it must travel through next. You fire there. You follow a stream of light. You do not see the second airplane that dies today. You see the geometry close. There is an important contradiction we must hold without softening it. The Me-262 was the future, and the future arrived in the exact moment when air war had become most about the ground. Not through duels of speed, but through timing and infrastructure. Not by being faster in the abstract, but by being present more often at the one place where faster cannot help you. By spring, even the German pilots who love the jet admit that their first hope, the fantasy of unchallenged altitude and speed supremacy, is gone. They fly their machines like sprinters forced to start in deep sand. They ask their crews for miracles their crews cannot give: engines with more hours, fuel without water, concrete without holes, sky without Mustangs. They look for patterns to beat back the Allied pattern. Sometimes they find one, often they don't, and always the Americans adapt. If the jets shift their timing, the escorts shift theirs. If the jets stack their landings, the strafers plan a second pass. If the flak grows denser by the threshold, the Mustangs re-arrive higher, steeper, faster, using the run and break tactic to throw off aim and still be down the runway at the critical second. The choreography in the sky is less elegant than the textbooks and more lethal than the stories let on. We hold here, at the edge of the climax, with a question that has been waiting since the first scene. What finally reframed the entire fight, not as Mustang versus jet, but as system versus system? What number? What day? What reveal made even the jet pilots understand that the runway had become the battlefield? Shadows lengthen on the concrete, and a red-striped FW-190 claws past the approach lights to keep watch while a jet makes its last turn. The gear comes down. The flaps droop. The air is heavy with kerosene and cordite. The trap is about to snap again. The flaps droop. The engines surge. The trap is about to close. What breaks the pattern is not a single burst or a lucky angle, but a change in how the Americans think about time. By late December 1944, escort plans stop ending at the target. They begin ending at enemy airfields. On January 1, 1945, the day the Luftwaffe gambles on Bodenplatte to smash Allied bases at dawn, Mustang flights over Germany are already flying a different war. Bomber cover into the teeth of flak, then disciplined loiter over jet fields exactly when those fields must light. The Germans choose morning surprise, the Americans choose calendar precision. One is a spike, the other is a metronome. Mid-March seals it. The 8th Air Force's day-long blows on rail and fuel push jet operations into tight, predictable windows. The 9th Air Force's fighter bombers add a quiet instruction to their packets. After the bombs, stay 20 minutes and watch the concrete. This is the midpoint reveal. Air superiority is no longer a dogfight outcome, but a scheduling outcome. The kill, if it comes, is just the receipt. The next scene is the proof. March 18, 1945, Neuburg and Lechfeld. The morning starts with contrails high and columns of smoke on the horizon, then settles into the clipped radio of an escort group. A Me-262 returns early, low on fuel. A four-ship of P-51s has been orbiting above the base for 19 minutes, because Intel says 19 to 24 is the average lag between a jet's last slash at a bomber stream and its flare for landing. The lead speaks once, gear, and drops. The jet commits to the groove. The first burst cuts the air like a zipper, walks across the starboard nacelle, and the engine blossoms in a dirty orange. The jet tries to ride it in and loses the fight a yard at a time. 5 minutes later, a second Me-262 appears on the initial, only to find the runway a strip of gray cratered like the moon. P-47s have just left delayed fuses chewing. The pilot floats the landing, touches down long, and breaks into rubble. He never sees the Mustang diving out of the sun. The field has become a trap with two jaws, one of time, one of terrain. The numbers that follow change the story we tell about speed. A jet that can outpace a Mustang by 100 miles an hour at altitude is forced twice a day to fly at 160, then 140, then 120, fixed speeds written into the book by physics and wheels. A fighter that cannot catch the jet in clean air can meet it where those numbers live. Once you frame the war that way, every choice shifts. Tank jettison timing, orbit altitudes, dive angles, fuse settings, even how long a pilot will stare at the same rectangle of concrete before trusting boredom. The Mustang is not beating the jet. The schedule is. The ground learns the same lesson. The Papa J FW-190 Airfield guards with their red and white bellies do launch and do fight. Brave, sharp, often effective for seconds that feel longer than they are. But their job description is a confession. The critical minute is not the climb, not the intercept, not the return to base taxi. It is the roll. The Germans are painting, gunning, and flying to protect the minute. The Americans are building whole escort plans to own it. By April, the before and after becomes stark. Before, jets appear out of sun and cloud as if mythical, untouchable. After, they appear in gun cameras falling in black spirals off the end of a runway with gear half down. Before, the hope is that speed can clean the board. After, the reality is that speed cannot arrive in time. The inversion is complete. The thesis lands in a single line. The jet's advantage died in the 90 seconds when it wasn't yet a jet. The consequences ripple outward, through squadrons, through depots, through memory. First, attrition by arithmetic. The Me-262 force is larger on paper than in the sky. Hundreds built, far fewer serviceable, dozens to a couple hundred operable at any given time. Sorties counted in tens per day per wing when fuel and runways cooperate. Every destroyed aircraft is not merely a loss in steel. It is a loss of hours of engine life that were rare, of fuel that was rationed, of crews that were irreplaceable. A single strafing attack that burns 2 jets and craters a runway can erase a day's worth of jet presence in the air. Not a duel. A subtraction across the board. Second, the cultural turn inside fighter groups. Pilots who once chased dogfights now run procedures. Briefings hinge on time on station and fuse intervals and expected pattern altitude. A P-51 flight lead tells his section to be earlier, and that phrase becomes a mantra. A P-47 element leader rehearses the seconds between bomb release and pull-up, so the delayed fuses will blossom exactly as the next pair of attackers crosses the threshold. The romance of the sky shrinks. The choreography of systems expands. There is still bravery, still skill. It just wears a watch. Third, the German answer hardens and narrows. Bases shift, decoys multiply, taxis become takeoff runs, and takeoff runs become taxis. Small fields hidden by copses light once and go dark. Autobahns host emergency operations that terrify the men who fly them. JV-44's Dora 9s, sleek, striped, unmistakable, learn to sprint like sheepdogs ahead of their jets, snapping at intruders and at their own flak's hair-trigger nerves. It works, sometimes brilliantly. But the pattern of loss continues because the pattern of exposure continues. The minute cannot be erased. It can only be masked, and only for a while. We watch this play out through a handful of lives to keep the scale honest. A German crew chief at Rheine spends a morning scavenging good blades from 2 damaged turbines to build 1 engine that will live another 4 hours. He hears the roar of strafers 3 times before noon. He risks his neck hauling a fire bottle across open ground to a smoking bay. In the afternoon, he writes numbers, temperatures, pressures, hours, into a notebook smudged with oil. He knows that if the runway stays cratered until evening, those hours will expire on paper, not in the air. An American flight leader in the 4th Fighter Group tries to teach his wingman not to overrun the second pass. 1 and out, he says, but he knows he will break his own rule if a jet shows its nose on the roll. He can recite from memory the shape of Achmer's approach lights and the exact distance from the south hedgerow to the first taxi spur at Hesepe. On the mess board, under today, someone has chalked not a city, but a list of airfields. A jet pilot, call him lieutenant, mid-20s, a handful of hours more than his machine, has felt once that clean shot at altitude when his world turned into pure speed. He is faithful to that memory. He straps in each time hoping for it again. He lives instead in the corridor between brake release and liftoff, where his hands move like a watchmaker's and where the shadow of a diving fighter is the last thing he wants to see. When he does fly clean and fast, when he feels the future again, it is often 5 minutes before the fuel gauge demands a return through the same corridor. He hates that corridor. He cannot fly without it. By late April 1945, the terrain itself has joined the Allied side. The front line is west of the Rhine in March, east of it by early April, pressing toward Bavaria by the third week. What was a long, risky leg to reach Neuburg in November is a routine leg from forward fields by spring. The net around the jet bases tightens geographically as well as temporally. The P-51s range that once meant escort to Berlin and back now also means linger over your chosen rectangle until the day gives you something. The P-47's toughness that once meant survive flak on a bridge now also means survive the black wall at the approach lights. The same virtues, redirected at the minute. We settle the case with a triad of figures and images that compress the system into evidence. A jet's acceleration curve, from idle to 100% thrust, is measured in long, delicate seconds. Throttle abuse means turbine blades crack, flame-out surge, engines die young. The schedule for engine changes is fantasy. Crews wring hours from scrap. The machine asks for gentleness in a place where gentleness is death. A runway's status board. One crater at the numbers turns every landing into a gamble. 3 craters staggered down the center line turn takeoffs into slaloms. A spall of concrete kicked into an intake can end an engine that took men and days to keep alive. Runway denial is not dramatic, but it compounds. A sortie log at a jet base across a week, days with weather, days with bombs, days with attacks, days with standby scribbled across half the lines. Total sorties flown versus total sorties scheduled becomes a ratio that tells the truth. The Luftwaffe's jets are present less often for shorter windows under more predictable conditions. The inversion that anchors the climax is complete. The future arrived bound to the ground, and the men who mastered the ground mastered the future. The war's last weeks are a slow, grinding resolution with flashes of awe and of ruin. There's a late April afternoon at Munich Rheine when JV-44's Doris shriek past the approach lights and bounce tracers off a diving P-51 long enough for a jet to plant its wheels and live. The Mustang, pulling 9G in a save from the black wall, climbs into hail and cloud with holes in its wings and a pilot whose arm is hot and wet under his glove. He will land 50 minutes later with a numb hand and the certainty that the thing that almost killed him was not the jet's speed, but the density of fire near concrete. There is a May morning at Lechfeld when P-47s run the length of the runway 4 times, guns chattering bright, and the 4th pass finds nothing living to argue back. The jets are there, some burned to frames, some intact but without fuel, some intact and fueled but without pilots who will fly them for the last hours of a lost war. A crew dog picks his way across the field and sits down beside a wheel with a cigarette and a stare. He is 21, and he looks 100. There is a moment, after the surrender, when American flyers walk around captured jets with curiosity and respect and a little disbelief. They measure. They climb into cockpits. They run up engines while nervous ground men hold extinguishers. They fly a few, and some come back grinning, and others come back shaken, and a few don't come back at all. They understand firsthand what the speed meant, and also what the runway meant. One pilot says later, at 25,000, it was a different world, but we didn't fight them in that world very often. He doesn't need to add why. The systemic consequences carry forward into doctrine. Air forces that read this campaign write new pages. Airfield denial is a mission set, not a side effect. Runway cratering is a line item, not an improvisation. Loiter time is a weapon, not a luxury. The minute of exposure becomes a checklist term. The runway becomes a target category with its own best practices. Delayed fuses, sequential passes, flak suppression, deception sweeps to bait defenders into revealing their rhythm. The lesson is not about jets alone. It is about any machine whose advantage depends on a speed it cannot have all the time. Memory sorts the story, too. The myth of the invincible jet lives because speed dazzles. Film loves a sleek silhouette slicing through contrails. Veterans remember on quieter nights a different picture. A strip of concrete with smoke lifting in lazy columns, red and white bellies of Doras hurling themselves into unfair odds, P-51s and P-47s flying ovals over the same field until the clock delivered them a target. Crews on both sides trying to keep engines alive in a world that killed engines for a living. The jet era began with a paradox, and men had to solve it with watches as much as with wings. When the counting finally stops, the ratios say what the scenes have shown. The jet was a technological leap shackled to a logistical cliff. Many lost not in duels at altitude, but in patterns at airfields, destroyed on takeoff, on landing, in dispersal, in maintenance, in the minutes that make or break an air war. The Allies did not need to be faster in the sky. They needed to be earlier at the runway. They were. We returned to the opening frame. Achmer again, November cold again, a mechanic's gloved hand lifting again. A jet noses forward, engines reluctant, wheels whispering. This time the eye lifts past the cockpit glass and past the pine line and finds what we missed in the first shot. High above, a pair of fighters arcing lazy circles with the sun in their pockets and a clock on their laps. The guns will speak. The jet will try to become what it was built to be. The concrete will decide the argument. Not through speed, but through timing. Not through a duel, but through a system. Not by outrunning the future, but by arriving at the 1 minute when the future cannot run. The fastest thing in the war was a plan that knew exactly when a runway made a jet mortal.